Most people don't leave because they lost feelings. They leave because the attraction faded. And here's the truth, most men never hear. People come back. Not when you chase them, but when they feel they lost access to you. Attraction isn't built through effort alone. It's built through how you carry yourself when things don't go your way. Attraction thrives on uncertainty, not certainty, and this is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in modern relationships. Most people assume that consistency, reassurance, and constant availability are what strengthen attraction. In reality, those things build comfort, not desire. Desire operates in a completely different space. It feeds on curiosity, anticipation, and the emotional tension of not fully knowing where you stand. When someone feels they have you completely figured out, when your reactions, your availability, and your intentions become predictable, the emotional intensity starts to flatten. Not because they stopped caring, but because the psychological stimulation that fuels attraction is no longer present. The human mind is wired to pay more attention to what feels uncertain than what feels guaranteed, which is why people often become more intrigued when something is not fully within their control. When you remove uncertainty by over-explaining yourself, constantly checking in, or always being available, you unintentionally lower the perceived value of your presence. It sends a subtle signal that your attention is easy to access, and what is easily accessible is rarely deeply appreciated. This doesn't mean playing games or being intentionally distant. It means understanding that attraction requires space to breathe. When there is no gap between interactions, no room for someone to wonder about you, think about you, or even miss you, the emotional experience becomes flat. Familiarity increases, but fascination decreases. People don't lean in when everything is already given to them. They lean in when there's something left to discover, something that isn't fully predictable. Uncertainty also creates emotional engagement because it activates the brain's reward system. When someone isn't completely sure how you feel or what you're going to do next, they invest more mental energy trying to figure it out. That investment builds attachment. It's the same reason why people often become more drawn to someone after a bit of distance or after a shift in behavior. They start analyzing, reflecting, and re-evaluating the connection. When everything is certain, there's no need for that process. The mind relaxes, and with that relaxation, the intensity of attraction often fades. This is why people sometimes take others for granted when they feel secure in their presence, only to feel a renewed sense of interest when that certainty is disrupted. Maintaining a level of uncertainty doesn't mean being unreliable or inconsistent in your character. It means not overextending yourself to control how someone perceives you. It means allowing your life to have its own structure, your time to have its own value, and your attention to be given with intention, rather than out of fear of losing someone. When your actions are grounded and self-directed instead of reactive, you naturally create a sense of intrigue. People begin to experience you rather than predict you, and that experience keeps attraction alive. The key difference is that you're not creating uncertainty through manipulation. You're creating it through independence, emotional control, and a life that doesn't revolve entirely around another person. Emotional detachment increases perceived value, and not in the cold, indifferent way people often misunderstand it. It's not about shutting down your emotions or pretending you don't care. It's about not allowing your emotions to control your behavior, especially in moments of uncertainty. Most people, when they feel a connection, begin to lean in too quickly. They seek reassurance, they over-invest, and they subtly start prioritizing the other person's attention over their own internal stability. This creates an imbalance where one person is giving more than the other, and in that imbalance, perceived value shifts. The one who appears less dependent, less reactive, and more self-contained naturally holds more psychological weight in the dynamic. Emotional detachment, in this sense, is the ability to stay grounded in your own center without chasing external validation to feel secure. When someone senses that your emotional state depends on their responses, their presence, or their approval, it creates pressure rather than attraction. People are drawn to those who feel complete on their own, not those who are quietly asking to be completed. Emotional detachment communicates that you enjoy the connection, but you don't rely on it to define your mood or your sense of self. That distinction changes everything. It removes the neediness that often pushes people away and replaces it with a calm confidence that pulls people in. When your reactions are measured and your energy remains stable, regardless of fluctuations in the interaction, it signals that your attention is valuable because it is not easily shaken or given away under emotional pressure. There is also a psychological principle at play where people assign more value to what feels limited or not fully possessed. When you are emotionally detached, your presence is felt as something chosen rather than something automatic. You're not constantly available, not constantly seeking engagement, and not constantly trying to maintain the connection at all costs. That restraint creates space for the other person to step forward. Instead of you doing all the emotional work, they begin to invest more, think more, and feel more because the dynamic invites their participation. Emotional detachment, when done correctly, doesn't push people away. It gives them room to come closer on their own terms, which often leads to stronger attraction because it feels self-driven rather than forced. Another important layer is how emotional detachment protects your self-worth. When you're not overly attached to an outcome, you're less likely to tolerate behavior that doesn't meet your standards. You don't chase clarity from inconsistent actions, and you don't try to convince someone to see your value. You observe, you assess, and you respond accordingly without losing your composure. That kind of emotional discipline is rare, and rarity itself increases perceived value. It shows that your boundaries are intact, your identity is stable, and your life continues moving forward regardless of who stays or leaves. This creates a quiet form of authority in how you carry yourself, where your presence feels intentional rather than dependent, and your attention feels earned rather than freely given under emotional pressure. Self-worth sets the standard for how others treat you, not through what you say, but through what you consistently accept, allow, and reinforce with your behavior. Most people believe respect is something you ask for or demand verbally, but in reality, it's something you demonstrate through your boundaries and your reactions. When your sense of self-worth is strong, you naturally filter out behavior that doesn't align with your standards without needing to argue, convince, or over-explain. You don't negotiate basic respect, and you don't stay in situations that require you to constantly prove your value. This creates a clear, unspoken message. Access to you is conditional on how you are treated. On the other hand, when self-worth is low or unstable, people tend to tolerate inconsistency, mixed signals, and emotional neglect, often justifying it in the hope that things will improve. That tolerance doesn't create connection. It creates permission for the same behavior to continue. Human behavior is adaptive, which means people adjust based on what they experience from you over time. If someone sees that you remain present and available even when they give minimal effort, they learn that your standards are flexible. If they notice that you respond quickly to neglect, chase after distance, or seek reassurance when things feel uncertain, it shifts the dynamic in a subtle but powerful way. You move from being someone who is chosen to someone who is trying to be chosen. This shift doesn't happen because you lack value. It happens because your behavior communicates that you are willing to lower your standards to maintain the connection. Self-worth, in contrast, stabilizes your behavior. It keeps your actions aligned with your standards even when emotions are involved, which is where most people lose control and compromise what they actually deserve. Another key aspect is that people are naturally drawn to environments where expectations are clear and consistent. When your self-worth is defined, your behavior becomes predictable in the right way. You are consistent in what you accept and what you walk away from. This consistency creates respect because there is no confusion about where you stand. You don't reward behavior that disrespects you with more attention, and you don't ignore red flags in exchange for temporary validation. Instead, you maintain a steady presence that reflects internal stability. That stability is what others respond to because it signals that your value is not dependent on external approval. It also creates a dynamic where the other person has to rise to meet your level rather than you lowering yourself to maintain their interest. Self-worth also influences how you interpret situations. When it's strong, you don't personalize every change in behavior or assume that you need to fix something to keep someone interested. You evaluate actions objectively, and if something doesn't align, you adjust your investment instead of overcompensating. This prevents emotional overreaction and keeps you from falling into patterns of chasing, overgiving, or trying to secure someone who is not showing consistent effort. The higher your self-worth, the less you are willing to trade your standards for temporary attention, and that alone reshapes how people engage with you. It creates a dynamic where your presence is associated with respect, clarity, and emotional stability rather than uncertainty, overextension, or silent compromise. People don't miss you, they miss how you made them feel, and that distinction changes how you understand attraction, connection, and why someone returns after distance. Most individuals assume that their presence alone is what creates attachment, but what actually lingers in someone's mind is the emotional experience tied to that presence. It's not just about who you were, what you said, or how often you showed up. It's about the feelings you consistently created when you were there. If someone felt understood, respected, challenged in a healthy way, or emotionally alive around you, those experiences don't disappear when you're gone. The brain doesn't hold on to people as static figures. It holds on to emotional imprints. Over time, those imprints often become more powerful than the reality of the person, especially when distance removes day-to-day distractions and replaces them with reflection. When you're constantly present in someone's life, those emotional experiences can become normalized. What once felt exciting, grounding, or unique starts to feel expected. This is where many people make the mistake of increasing effort, thinking that doing more will maintain the same level of attraction. In reality, overexposure often reduces emotional impact. When something is always available, the brain stops registering it as special, no matter how meaningful it once was. But when there is space, when your presence is no longer constant, the emotional memory begins to stand out again. The mind starts to compare current experiences with past ones, and if those past experiences were strong, they gain more significance over time. This is why people often feel a renewed sense of missing someone after a period of separation, even if they were the ones who initially pulled away. Another layer to this is that emotions are rarely replaced at the same depth or intensity. Someone may meet new people, have new interactions, and stay occupied, but if those experiences don't replicate the emotional quality they had with you, your memory becomes more distinct. It's not about being perfect or better than everyone else. It's about being different in a way that created a specific emotional response. Maybe you brought a sense of calm when their life felt chaotic, or maybe you created excitement and unpredictability that broke their routine. Whatever the case, those emotional contrasts leave a lasting impression because they stand out from what is familiar. When that contrast is gone, the absence becomes noticeable, and that's often when the feeling of missing you begins to surface. This is also why trying to remind someone of your value through words rarely works as effectively as your absence does through experience. You can explain your intentions, your effort, and your perspective, but those things don't recreate emotion. They just describe it. Emotion is felt through interaction, and once that interaction is removed, the only thing left is the memory of how it felt. If that memory carries weight, it will naturally draw attention back to you over time without needing constant reinforcement. The key is that those feelings were genuine and not forced, because authenticity is what makes emotional experiences stick. When you focus on creating real, grounded interactions instead of trying to impress or secure someone, you leave behind something more lasting than surface-level attraction, a feeling that continues to exist even when you're no longer there in front of them. Loss triggers reflection more than presence does, because the human mind is not designed to fully evaluate something while it still has constant access to it. When someone is consistently in your life, available, predictable, and present, there's no urgency to analyze their value. The brain prioritizes what feels uncertain or at risk, not what feels secure and guaranteed. This is why people often overlook what they have while they have it, not out of malice, but because there's no psychological trigger pushing them to step back and assess it. Presence creates familiarity, and familiarity, while comfortable, reduces the need for conscious appreciation. The relationship becomes part of the routine, and anything that becomes routine fades into the background of attention, no matter how meaningful it once felt. When loss enters the picture, whether through distance, withdrawal, or a complete absence, it disrupts that routine. The brain shifts from passive experience to active evaluation. Instead of simply interacting with you, the person is now thinking about you, replaying moments, comparing what they had with what they currently experience. This reflection is not something that can be forced through conversation or persuasion. It happens internally when the external stimulus is removed. The absence creates space, and in that space, the mind begins to process what was previously taken for granted. Small details that once seemed insignificant start to carry more weight, and emotional experiences that were normalized begin to stand out in contrast to the present moment. There's also a psychological principle tied to loss aversion, where people feel the impact of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of having it. While someone may have appreciated your presence on some level, the full emotional weight of that appreciation often doesn't register until it's gone. Loss creates contrast, and contrast sharpens perception. When you're no longer there to provide the same energy, attention, or emotional experience, the difference becomes noticeable in a way it never was during consistent access. This is why people sometimes gain clarity only after distance. They are no longer distracted by the day-to-day interaction and can see the dynamic more objectively. Another factor is that presence allows for distraction, while absence forces focus. When you're around, any doubts, frustrations, or inconsistencies can be softened or overlooked because the interaction continues. There's always another conversation, another moment, another opportunity to maintain the connection without fully questioning it. But when that interaction stops, there's nothing to distract from the thoughts that arise. The mind naturally tries to resolve that gap by analyzing what changed, what was lost, and whether it mattered more than initially realized. This process often leads to a deeper understanding of the connection, but it only happens because the constant input has been removed. This is also why trying to make someone realize your value while you're still fully present often has limited impact. When access remains unchanged, there is no pressure to reassess. Words can be heard, but they rarely create the same level of internal reflection as absence does. Reflection requires space, and space only exists when something is no longer immediately available. When you step back, whether intentionally or as a natural outcome of the situation, you allow the other person to experience that contrast without interference. And it's within that contrast that real evaluation begins to take place. The goal isn't to make someone realize your value after they lose you. The goal is to live in a way where your value is clear without needing validation, explanation, or constant presence. When you understand how attraction works, uncertainty, emotional control, self-worth, and space, you stop trying to force outcomes and start focusing on your standards. You don't chase reflection, you don't chase attention, and you don't chase people to recognize what you bring. You become consistent in how you carry yourself, disciplined in your emotions, and selective with your time and energy. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic of how others experience you, because now your presence feels intentional, not automatic, and your absence feels noticeable, not replaceable.